And to me, this is the most important caveat. If the only set of credentials you have for authentication to your router are one-time credentials, well, you sure as hell had better configure some other credentials when you're logged in with those one-time credentials, because what's going to happen, like in this case, we have R2, we have one-time credentials set up with the username, vendor, password, Cisco, so we access it from R1, we telnet in, we use these credentials, and when we use these credentials, remember that iOS is going to remove them from the running configurations. So now when I issue the show run include username, we can see there are no username password combinations configured on this router, and I go ahead and log out. And one thing to keep in mind across all of this is that the iOS is not going to warn you. It's not going to tell you, hey, you just used a one-time credential. It's not going to say before you log out you might want to configure another credential that isn't, temporary. It's not going to give you that. You can throw some of that into a banner if you're accessing with this username, it's a one-time blah blah blah, but there's no mechanism in iOS to cover your ass with this. So in this case we log out, and now we basically do not have remote access to this router because it's going to log in, and I guess I should have mentioned in this case it's going to say use the local username database for authentication. So you try to telnet in here and you use vendor, and that is gone. You could use any one you want because there are no username password combinations set up on this router, so keep that in mind. This is probably the one time where writing the configuration after configuring a one-time user credential actually comes in handy, because if that was the case you would have this username password in your startup configuration, and once you got orphaned, at least you could just have somebody power cycle the router. It would come up into the startup configuration and this username password would be available once again for one-time use. Alright, a little later in the game than I usually introduce this, but this is the command. It's a username command, so it's username, then you provide a name, and then the one-time option. And we went over this. This is just basically a slide that shows you the Cisco documentation for this command. It is important to remember that it's under the username command documentation. You see here that it was introduced in iOS 12.4. Alright, in summary, one-time passwords or one-time credentials basically come in handy when you want to allow an untrusted user to access your router. True to its name, they use them once and they're gone. iOS will take it out of the running configuration. You do need to be running iOS version 12.4 or later, and there are a couple caveats that we just went over, but this feature does come in handy again when you're allowing untrusted users access to your router. And at the beginning of the lesson I described a scenario where this was actually a better fix than having somebody access the ACS and configure a new username password every time. Okay, well that's going to wrap this up. I hope you join me on the CLI for the lab portion of this, which should be pretty quick. Thanks for joining me in the Packet Lab.